Is Earth millions of years old?
Or is it just over 6,000 years old?
How do we reconcile the two?
Can we?
To answer this, we have to go back before Genesis.
Hi, I'm Kristen.
And I'm Penny. Welcome to
Live Life in the Spirit. We are super excited that you've come to our site today.
Either on purpose or happy accident.
If you're looking for
Real truth,
real joy, real Jesus, you've come to the right place.
Hi, we are your hosts. I'm Pastor Penny Schulz.
And I'm Kristen Kipper.
And welcome to
Live Life in the Spirit.
You can find this episode and all of our other exciting content on livelifeinthespirit.com.
There you can get our podcast, blogs, and our merchandise. We are so glad you're joining us today. This series could be very explosive in some circles.
And no doubt you found yourself in a debate at one time or another over just how old the Earth is.
When did dinosaurs exist?
And were there dinosaurs on the Ark? I just came back from the Ark Encounter, and the Ken Ham, I think it is, and his whole group, they have the Creation Museum and everything, they believe the dinosaurs were on the Ark, and they have quite the case. There, you can make cases for a lot of things, so let's see what the scriptures have to say.
In the last episode, we touched on the Hebrew terms in Genesis 1-2 for tohu and bohu. In case listeners missed last episode or have forgotten, or to even refresh my memory, why don't you go ahead and tell us what those two phrases mean?
Tohu and bohu mean without form and void. God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, the lexicon from the Hebrew linguist in history, the most basic meaning of tohu is formlessness, confusion, unreality, and emptiness. Formlessness of a primeval earth of land reduced to primeval chaos, as it's seen in Isaiah 24:10, 34:11, and 45:18. And nothingness, an empty space of empty, trackless waste, like we see in Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, and Job chapter 6, verse 18.
So it sounds like tohu and bohu are in the Bible quite a bit.
We just wouldn't know that because we don't speak Hebrew.
This is true. The important part of that is it's land reduced to a chaotic state, not land formed that way in the beginning. There's a distinct difference.
And the second definition of the same word, figurative, empty, unreal, groundless idols. I like that.
Formlessness, it was reduced to chaos and this trackless waste.
That paints a whole different picture, doesn't it?
It does. Not just something that was formless, but something that became that way.
So in order for it to be reduced to this, it had to be something
Before.
Tohu
became associated with this idea of malevolence and chaos.
Now bohu, the void, and that's how we read it in the English language. But in lexicon, it's earth under judgment. That's a totally different concept than how we read it.
Yes, it is. Some sort of devastation. Stones were used to break down walls. So something was used to break down something that had been created.
Speak of a destructive evil that reduced earth to chaos and brought the planet under judgment.
All of this is well before God ever said, and it was good.
Yeah, all this was in verses 1 and 2. Now, I want to get into a little history, because this is where a lot of people get into the frustration of God created everything in a day. Well, our English definition says, or I should say our English translation says day. But in Hebrew, it's yom. And that takes on a whole different meaning, because yom can be day, or it can be a period of time. It can mean yesterday, today, and tomorrow, or it can mean years. An example of that would be in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. It says, David was old and stricken in, our English translation says years, But in Hebrew, it says yom. Well, now we know he wasn't a day old when he was old and stricken in years.
So it's not a smooth translation.
No, so yom can be very broad. So when we say God created everything, and of course I know we go, there was morning and there was night. Again,
Well,
when was morning and when was
night
at that particular point? We see another time where it says, to God, a day is but 1,000 years. Because even people who believe in the young earth, they will argue that a day is 1,000 years. Because we see that in 2 Peter 3, chapter 3, verse 8.
Right.
Dear friends, don't overlook this one fact. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like one day. But is that literal?
Or is it a metaphor?
Exactly, it is a metaphor. It wasn't literal. When the young earth people will say that they believe that God could have taken 1,000 years for each day, how they come up with the 6,000 years, that's not a literal day then. That's
right.
A period of time. And if it's going to be a period of time, if it's a metaphor, then how big was that period of time? We don't know. We are not God, and we weren't there with God when he did it.
It's true.
Now, there's also another spot where it talks about the day of the Lord by the prophets. So in Revelation, it talks about the new heavens and the new earth.
It's a recreation. God will create a new something out of what was. We would argue that he did that after the flood because everything that was before the flood changed after the flood.
Exactly why, if you go to the Creation Museum, they argue that there were dinosaurs on the ark. We did our 2 and 3 episode, I think it was, or maybe it was 3 and 4.
I think it was 2 and 3.
3 or 4, something like that. Yeah. When we looked at all of that, it was, well, we had all these reasons why there were dinosaurs still on the earth when man was on the earth,
right.
Because of fossils that showed a human print, and then later a dinosaur print.
Well, and all of the carvings that are on so many of the statues and so many of the ancient structures around the world, how would they have known what they looked like? Even if they had found skeletal remains, maybe, but they wouldn't have had the details that they did.
And they found thorns and thistles in the bellies of
dinosaurs,
fossilized dinosaurs. And it says right in the scriptures that thorns and thistles did not come about until after the fall of man, and they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So we have lots of reasons to believe that, yes, dinosaurs definitely could have been. Of course, it was a version of this. You have to realize, as we're going to dig more into that later as well, the dinosaurs were more of an herbivore. Because everything that God had created was good. We're going to argue that it was an outside source, aka the fallen realm, that started tampering with a lot of stuff, not just the humans, but also the animal realm. And that's how we got these big, massive carnivore dinosaurs and everything else.
And nothing ate meat before the fall.
Exactly. And if you look at the Ark encounter, if you have a chance to go, it's in Kentucky, I would highly recommend it. It is just, it's colossal and it's a sight to behold. If nothing else, it just blows your mind of how, yeah, it probably did look then. I mean, and we think of the boat as being chaotic and in a flood and in this judgment time and animals on top of each other and somehow Noah kept from getting eaten or stepped on. Not the case at all. I mean, they had cages for everything. Then they had a feeding system and a watering system and way to store everything. But they took the smaller stuff. So why we bring that up is because after the flood, the entire environment changed. I mean, it had never rained before the flood. So everything was different. And animals died out and different ones came about because of the new atmosphere.
Yes, the atmosphere changed, the earth changed, the temperature. It was all fairly tropical, is the understanding, and science can reinforce those things, but everything was different.
And we see in Revelation, that's at the beginning of the book in Genesis, but in Revelation, God doesn't create a new heaven and a new earth. He takes the earth and the heaven that's already there and he recreates that by getting rid of sin, by getting rid of evil. Okay, so we're going to dig in to Genesis 1:1. And today we're actually kind of going on from last episode with the Before Genesis book by Donna Howell and Dr. Thomas Horn. We're going to pick just through a few of these things that are going to set up where we want to go into Enoch. But the Hebrew translation is Bereshit bara Elohim et ha shataim ve'et eretz. What that is, the literal translation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now it says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We don't know when that beginning was.
We do not.
That's just what we know. Then if you look at verse 2, it's Ve'haretz eta tohu va bohu ve'kohashka al pene ve'hom ve'rosh Elohim merakafet al pene ha'mayim, which says,
Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
Now that's the part that we always read. And that's still verse 2. But did you notice that? Now the earth was formless and void, which is the tohu bohu that we talked about. And so you get the whole other translation of what those two words mean in Hebrew.
God created the heavens and the earth, and then there was judgment upon the earth, and it was formless because something had been destroyed.
Now, actually, we're going to blow your mind with a little more stuff that's going to interlink science, even more science than you thought you knew, into the scriptures. So the tohu bohu, the formless and void, or chaos and emptiness, it describes the initial state of the earth before God formed and filled it. The tehom is the deep or abyss, referring to the primordial deep waters, and the mereshephet is hovering, brooding, or moving. Now, did you notice that the word in that, the tehom, is, where we talk about the deep, it's also called the abyss. And how many times in scriptures do we read about the abyss? We're going to get into this hovering and moving too. Now, this is something a lot of people don't know. Bara, if you've heard that, it's like, it means creation. But it also means recreation. So when we read God created in Hebrew, it could be God created or recreated. If we're going to look then in verse 3 to kind of round this out. Ve'yomer Elohim ve'yahi or, which is,
And God said, Let there be light, and there was light.
So or is the Hebrew word for light. So the vehi, or whatever is let there be.
And then there was.
And then there was. Ve'yar Elohim et ha, or kito, ve'vadel Elohim, bena ha, or ve'ha koshek. And that means,
And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
a lot of people immediately assume, because of our English translation, that when we look out and we see the sun, that's light and darkness. But what is another transliteration of light and darkness?
Good and evil.
Exactly. Jesus talks about this in the Gospels. He says, you are sons of the light. Anyone who walks in the light can see, but those who are in the darkness cannot. This isn't talking about the sun and the moon, or this is talking about good and evil. And when he decides to recreate, I will argue, he saw the light, meaning the good, and he said it was good. This is the first time. It isn't until the end of verse 3 that God says it is good.
This is true.
Well, Donna Howell talks about one theory. It's called the gap theory.
And it's the time represented between the first two verses in Genesis. In the very beginning, God created space, planets, and at least some form of life. But after this, and before verse 2, sin entered the picture through the satanic rebellion, so that rendering the earth without form and void. Because we know that the angelic realm was here long before we were. And we know they fell long before we came along. And that's why they were able to influence Adam and Eve.
Thus, the creation week that follows is not the very first creative act of God, but a restorative act to bring back what he first made. So scholars have no idea how much time was between these two. If science says that the earth is billions of years old, but biblical chronology demands that Adam was created around 4000 BC, well, both can still be correct. This is the problem, because we see this big disconnect and this fight between Christians and scientists, and well, they both can't be right. Well, or can they?
Genesis 1:2 describes the earth as covered in water, or the deep. Now, to understand that further, we need to look at the conversation between God and Job. Where were you, Job, when I, God, laid the foundations of the earth? He talks about laying out the planet's formations. When the morning stars sang together and all of the sons of God shouted for joy. The term morning stars and sons of God are well known in Hebrew as a reference to the angels.
And the fact that they're here celebrating creation is a time stamp that points back to a time even before the angels carried out the foremost sin. So next, when God talks about shutting up the seas with the doors, when it breaks forth, then it shows his ability to limit Earth's water, so the planet will not fall prey to
perpetual flooding. But when it breaks forth, many scholars say it refers to the flood with Noah.
So the scriptures do talk about all of this.
We just don't look at it. So much of the scripture, if you take a piece here and a piece here, they can give you the full puzzle. But if we don't do that, we're left with an incomplete picture.
Well, this is now getting to be the exciting part that most people have never even thought of. And we get this from Job, from Genesis 1:2.
We bring all of this up to connect the gap theorists that say this mention is referring to the deep in Genesis 1:2. And as Penny referenced from Job, this next part is interesting because it says ice or frost from heaven, that waters somehow hardened, so they are hid like stone, and the deep is in a state of being frozen.
Yeah, it's frozen because it's now hard. So frost from heaven would be ice. But okay, here's where the connection is, because the order by many scholars, earth was created while the angels shouted for joy. Then the ocean somehow, and for some reason, froze. This goes along with the geologists proposing the theory of the early ice age, which is also called the snowball age. I thought that was funny. They say this was long ago, as much as 2.4 billion years ago, when the planet was completely covered in ice, which accounts for the bizarre paramagnetic shifts within the sedimentary rock layers at the equator that appeared to be glacial in origin. So this whole time we had people arguing about how can the earth be so many billions of years old and there was an ice age, but how could there be an ice age? Because we know what the scriptures say. Well, guess what?
The scriptures do in fact talk about this very potential.
Because of the ice age, then how did everything get buried when it thawed out?
This could bring about a two-flood theory, which as we keep digging in doesn't seem so crazy. We know that the Holy Spirit is the breath of God. He was also the one who hovered or moved over the oceans of the earth in the beginning.
That's what we talked about, the breath of God, and you hear that whole hovering over. We know that that is the Holy Spirit right there. We see this again with Noah in Genesis 9:1. God tells Noah to replenish the earth after the flood had wiped out the wicked inhabitants. So twice, it's the same word, replenish.
Which means to replace or fill with something
that used to be there. This is another thing that we're going to get into I get excited about this because it just keeps proving that what we always thought we knew, we really don't know. There's megalithic stones made of these big ziggurats that predate Adam, survived the flood. So who made them? And where did this technology come from? Well, we're going to look at some of these really cool structures.
Göbekli Tepe is this fascinating site that they have found in Turkey. It was built 6,000 years before Adam, if you will, with the young earth, because they're saying it's about 10 to 12,000 years old. Mm-hmm. Now, Karahan Tepe is a sister site that some archaeologists say is even several thousand years older than Göbekli Tepe. There's ancient rock formations, massive stones that would be impossible to move, which would have been hunter-gatherer time period. There are ornate symbols that are carved, which they wouldn't have had the ability to do that, according to what?
Because this isn't just chisels.
No, this is very ornate walls and on the stones.
Now there's examples of Herculean stones weighing hundreds of tons. They can be found above Lake Titicaca in Peru. Tiahuanaco, 12 miles south of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. There's even larger ones at the south entrance of Baalbek in eastern Lebanon. It's famous for its magnificent temple ruins.
Even when we were underneath the Temple Mount, in the tunnels in Jerusalem, there were massive, massive stones that were part of the foundation of the temple that would have been the same size and weight and would have thought to have been impossible to move.
Yeah, but they're even smaller than these, though. Even those magnificent stones down there
were smaller.
Oh, way smaller.
Oh, wow.
Way smaller than
those
these.
Those were tons, yeah.
Yeah. And then here's the other thing. There's various wheel ruts by vehicles, be carts or these like sidecars that some suggest. Some ruts may have been astronomical and religious purposes, but they say most of them were probably, because they were deliberately aligned as a calendar to mark things like the solstice, which we saw that when we went at Gilgal Raphaim. They have now come out to show that below what the original Gilgal Raphaim that we went and saw was the original structure that was over 6,000 years before that. So now we're talking almost 12,000 years before Adam.
And it's interesting because they have found multiple sites in that region around Turkey that have similar structures, similar pillars, similar drawings, massive structures. If life existed at that point and existed the way we would have thought it did, none of that was possible.
No, and the preciseness, like even right there at Gilgal, even this is the second one on it, where the hole was, it lines right up at the solstice. But they say, with these ruts, that while a lot of them do align with that most of them are probably just for transport.
The Neolithic time was 12,000 BC. It ends 4,500 BC. So this places these ruts between 8 and 5,000 years before Adam.
Yeah, and how's that possible? Because we don't know that Adam knew the wheel.
So these ruts are either man-made, if our dating is off, or something else made them. Something else had a civilization on the earth before Adam.
And this is what we do know from extra-biblical text, is that the angels have knowledge. They have way far superior knowledge than us. And that was what they were getting in trouble for, was passing that knowledge around. So if they had this knowledge, of course they would have used it. Mm-hmm. That doesn't really go without saying, really.
Right.
What I thought was fascinating is just off the shores of Lake Titicaca is the city of the gods. And in the city of the gods, it measures a perfect 23 square foot space. And it's known as the Gate of the Gods. Now, a second name for this artifact is the doorway of the serpent, because there's a rock formation that appears to be this big snake slithering up through the soil. And you can only see from an aerial shot. So how would any of these people back then have even known about this if this was actually done during man's time?
They wouldn't. And it seems to me there are other things we've seen. Serpentine structures that can only be seen from the air that predate what we know of man.
Now, in the middle of this flat rock is a recessed impression of a 6-foot-high thing that resembles a keyhole. But as you get close to it, it's more the size of a door, and there is the dark spot that's the hole. But there's a couple of legends about priests using things to go through this doorway. Basically, they were calling it a portal, and they were going into the other realm. These priests who did that, they were never seen from again.
Imagine that.
But many say it's a stargate. And the Native Americans say that it is a gateway to the land of the gods.
If you have not watched any of our episodes on stargates, portals, and wormholes, check it out. They are all over the place.
Now, some will say that the Incans carved it, even though the Incans will fervently deny it, that it was already there long before they ever got there. So for every discussion, every hypothesis, every theory, argument brought up, there can be something to refute it.
Right. So why are we talking about this today? To allow you to take God out of the box that you have put him in, and we have all put him in, because God is infinitely more than anything we could ever imagine.
And from the Bible, yes, we know he created the angels, and first long before man.
And yes, we know that the angels fell. And they fell where? Well, it could argue here on earth, where they have continued to be.
Well, we know that Satan is walking around on earth. It's throughout all the scriptures. And in Job, he walks up to heaven, to God's throne room. Somehow, he still is able to travel back and forth, which is why they'll argue that Satan is not part of that 200, because they could not, and they're in change. Where he's...
I think he's above that. I really do. He doesn't get his hands dirty.
No, he has his minions to do that.
He influences people.
I would even argue that the whole Lucifer thing with the name, and we could even spend a whole episode just on that, because it's not his name. In Hebrew, it's Hallel. Somehow, when the printing press came out, it got translated to Lucifer.
Right.
Which makes you wonder. We know how many entities that are around, how many of the angels fell. So who is Lucifer, that he duped everybody into thinking that he's Hallel?
He's the big bad, yep.
I don't know. I really want to dig a little more into that. Again, does it matter? No, probably not. But the fact is that he is real. We'll just say Lucifer, because that's what everybody knows him as. So he's able to walk back and forth. He was able to talk to God, and he was able to persuade Eve. He's able to persuade a lot of people. He is the head of dominions and powers and principalities, and there is a whole arcing system, top down, and they're all vying. And now Jesus calls him the Satan, which is a title.
Right.
And I would argue that there's several that have been fighting for this title all along, but
they want
that's
top
for
dog.
another day.
Right.
So in the first 2 verses of Genesis, we will stake the claim that it was here where the angels fell. God had created earth, and they were judged by God.
They caused chaos on the earth, and it was in verse 3 that God said, "Let there be light," and he separated the good from the evil.
This just allows us to think deeper about the spiritual angelic side, to not dismiss them or their fall.
To acknowledge that they were endowed with much more knowledge than us. But we will take a deeper dive into that in upcoming episodes.
But ultimately, why does this matter? Because God is still in control. Because we're kind of in a time frame, I would say right now, where most people look at everything going on in the world and they think that definitely God is no longer in control.
Right.
That they think this is chaos. This is nothing compared to the chaos that he used to. I think about that. You think about the chaos of toddlers running around or kids at a birthday party or whatever, but the parent's still in charge. There's ensuing chaos, but that chaos was of a totally different nature, yet he was still in charge. So no matter who the one is that is rebelling, we can be assured that none of this is taking him by accident. So no matter who the one is that is rebelling, we can be assured that it is not taking God by surprise.
And he could have called it quits. When the angels fell and he had to do all that he did, he could have just said, but he didn't. He didn't wash his hands of the angels, and he didn't wash his hands of creating. He still made man in his own image. And that brings us to Genesis 6 and the book of Enoch, which is where we're headed next.
I would also say that God not only is in control, but he also still holds judgment. That's the other big thing. We're in a world right now that God is just love. He is love. But he's also a God of judgment. The scriptures are full of that. I mean, he allows us a lot of space.
He does.
And he wants us to choose the right path. He wants us to come back to him. He wants us to accept his son.
And he will certainly turn up the heat to remind us of the importance of choosing wisely.
But we know that God judged the angels. We know that he judged the world before Noah. And we know that in Revelation, he is going to judge again, and he's going to judge at the final judgment. It's a lot of judging, really.
It is. And in a world that has tried to soften it and to make him
Santa Claus.
Yeah. A jolly, happy man that loves everyone and accepts everyone, and everyone gets into heaven.
Because if there's no judgment, then that means there's no accountability.
And then, why would we call ourselves Christians? Because, let's be honest, if there's no judgment and there's no accountability and God loves everyone, Christ did not have to die and suffer.
Exactly. If everybody gets into heaven, then there was no point for any of this.
Right. And that is a dangerous, dangerous path to go down.
So this has been kind of an interesting little two-part series. This before Genesis, but it's given us a chance to springboard off of that, because so many people want to talk about Enoch. We want to talk about the, those fallen angels, but in order to learn that, we first need to learn a little bit more about where they came from. So before they came and they fell really bad the second time, because I know there is a lot of people that go, well, that's just not fair. They made one mistake. And God says there's no redemption. I would argue that wasn't the first time they fell. And you see that. I guess, what do we call that? A repeat offender, only of the higher degree.
Right.
At some point, and we're going to get more into this in Enoch, what the actual sin was.
Such an abomination.
I know we've given you a lot to chew on, a lot to ponder and to pray on.
Which we would encourage you to do. What does this information mean to you?
Maybe nothing, and then again, maybe it will spur you to dig a little deeper, to know God a little fuller,
to understand his enormous love for you and for his creation even more.
And that it's okay to have differing opinions on a lot of the things that we don't have concrete, rock solid evidence for. But sometimes I think we get so stuck in our own line of thinking that we're not willing to look outside of those parameters. And I'm willing to listen to anyone, really. Will I give any credibility to them if they line up against the scriptures? And everything in here lines up to the scriptures. But I can still listen to them. Mm-hmm. And I can not be hateful.
Right.
And I can tell them, well, that's one heck of a thought. But then that allows me to share my view. And that's the problem. We don't know how to have those conversations anymore. Because if we can't even talk about this it just shows we can't talk about anything anymore in this world. If somebody doesn't like my opinion, well then, they're going to go straight to hell, kind of. It's terrible.
It is.
Ultimately, we want you to know that God loves you so much, and he wanted you so badly that he was willing to create, to recreate, and then again to recreate the earth after the flood. And then
he will recreate again the new heaven and the new earth when Christ comes back for the ultimate judgment on the fallen realm and puts the end to that ancient serpent, that chaos dragon that was subdued at the beginning of Genesis and then is eliminated at the end of Revelation.
If you did not watch the first episode, we encourage you to go back and watch that as well. And we're super excited as we're going to dive in to the book of Enoch a lot deeper than we did the first time. We're going to be a lot bolder and, go where we've not gone before.
It's true.
At least publicly. Because once you know, you can't unknow. And once you choose to do that information, well, that's up to you. But you can't say, we didn't tell you. So until next time.
Shalom.